Have you ever looked into a mirror and felt that something was off? That your reflection might be watching you just a little too closely? Mara never believed in the supernatural, until she discovered that her own reflection had a mind of its own. What if the person staring back at you wasn't you at all? Introduction. Mara lived a seemingly ordinary life. A young woman in her 20s, she worked at a small bookstore and enjoyed quiet evenings with a cup of tea and a good book. She never believed in the supernatural or ghosts, until one fateful night changed everything. The beginning. It was a late evening when Mara finished her shift. The streets were unusually quiet, the cold wind rustling the fallen leaves. As she walked home, a strange sensation crept over her, an unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She turned around, scanning the empty sidewalk behind her, but saw nothing. Shaking off the paranoia, she quickened her pace. The first signs. Upon reaching her apartment, she locked the door and sighed in relief. Perhaps she was just exhausted. She placed her bag on the table and headed to the kitchen to prepare a cup of tea. But as she passed by the hallway mirror, something felt wrong. Her reflection wasn't entirely in sync with her movements. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But there. When she lifted her hand, the reflection hesitated for a split second before copying her. The horror escalates. Mara froze in place, staring at her own face. Then, suddenly her reflection smiled. She hadn't moved her lips. A cold dread settled in her stomach. She reached for her phone, desperate to call a friend, but the screen went black. Her reflection in the dark screen of her phone was still smiling, wide and unnerving. The unfolding nightmare. The lights in the apartment flickered violently. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist. A whisper, soft, almost gentle, called her name. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her breathing became erratic as the feeling of being watched intensified. Every exit was locked. Every window refused to budge. The haunting deepens. Days passed, and Mara's paranoia grew. She started avoiding mirrors altogether, but reflective surfaces were everywhere. The television screen, the glass windows at work, the silverware in the kitchen. Each one seemed to hold something sinister lurking beneath. She noticed her reflection was always watching her, even when she wasn't looking directly at it. At night, she heard muffled whispers coming from the bathroom mirror. They grew louder, more insistent, as if something on the other side was trying to break through. A cry for help. Desperate, Mara confided in her best friend, Natalie. Skeptical but concerned, Natalie agreed to stay over one night to prove there was nothing to fear. The night started calmly, but as midnight approached, the temperature in the apartment dropped drastically. The whispers returned. This time, Natalie heard them too. The bathroom mirror trembled, the glass warping as if something was pressing against it from the other side. Natalie grabbed Mara's arm, urging her to leave, but the door refused to open. The whispers turned into frantic screams, and suddenly, the mirror shattered outward, sending shards flying. The entity emerges. From the broken mirror stepped Mara's doppelgänger. It was identical to her, yet completely wrong. Its eyes were black voids, its grin unnaturally wide. Natalie screamed as the entity lunged at them. It moved with an unnatural speed, dragging Mara toward the broken glass. She fought back, kicking and screaming, but its grip was like steel. A desperate escape. Natalie, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a large shard of mirror and slashed at the entity. It let out an ear-piercing shriek and recoiled. Mara took the opportunity to scramble away, her arm bleeding from the struggle. The entity writhed, its form distorting, as though the mirror was the only thing tethering it to this world. In a last act of desperation, Mara grabbed a heavy object and smashed what remained of the mirror into dust. The entity let out one final, deafening scream before vanishing into nothingness. The aftermath. Breathing heavily, Mara and Natalie stared at the remains of the mirror, now nothing more than scattered fragments. The room was silent again. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence gone. But Mara knew better than to believe it was truly over. The lingering threat. Days later, Mara moved out of the apartment, unwilling to take any more risks. But the horror followed her. One evening, she caught her reflection watching her again. Not in a mirror this time, but in a darkened window. It smiled. The Forgotten Origins. Mara began researching the history of the mirror. What she discovered was more horrifying than she could have imagined. The mirror had once belonged to a woman named Lydia Harrow, who mysteriously vanished in the 1920s. Local legends spoke of her experiments with the occult, trying to communicate with something beyond the veil of reality. Witnesses claimed she had succeeded, but at a terrible cost. Her doppelgänger had emerged, and soon after, Lydia was never seen again. The mirror changed hands over the years, each owner reporting strange occurrences before ultimately disappearing. The entity grows stronger. Mara's encounters with her double grew worse. It no longer needed mirrors to appear. She would see it standing at the foot of her bed at night, watching her silently. Its presence was suffocating, draining the warmth from the room. When she moved, it mimicked her, but with an unnatural delay. One night, she woke to find it leaning over her, its cold breath against her cheek. She screamed, but no one could hear. Natalie's fate. Natalie tried to distance herself, fearing she was next, but it was too late. One night she vanished without a trace. Mara found her apartment eerily untouched, except for one thing: a single mirror left in the center of the living room. When Mara looked into it, she saw Natalie inside, banging desperately, her screams silent within the glass. The final confrontation. Determined to end this nightmare, Mara sought help from a paranormal investigator. Together, they devised a plan to trap the entity back into the realm it came from. Armed with ancient rituals and salt circles, they lured the entity into a final battle. The night was filled with shrieks and whispers as the entity resisted. The mirrors in the house cracked violently as its rage grew. But as the ritual neared completion, the entity's movements slowed. With one final chant, the investigator shattered the last mirror, and a deafening silence followed. The open ending. Weeks passed, and for the first time in months, Mara felt safe. But one evening, as she walked past a shop window, she glanced at her reflection. It stood there, staring back. And then it winked. If you enjoyed this terrifying tale, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling horror stories. And remember, next time you look into a mirror, be sure that your reflection moves exactly when you do, or you might not be alone.